Well, welcome everyone. Great to see some familiar names and faces there. Thanks for coming along to this TASA Thursday session, which is highlighting our Sociology of Music thematic group. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. I'm on the lands of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations at RMIT in Melbourne. And I respectfully acknowledge elders past and present and extend that respect to all Indigenous people. And yes, our Sociology of Music group, Christy Bosworth and Hannah Fairlamb are going to speak today. Among our members, we have something like 24 members, I believe, at the moment, and we're about a year and a half into this group, which we overlap with, various other thematic groups in TASA, as is usually the case, I guess. But that sort of shows the sort of different angles from which people come to the sociology of music, and music itself being a very interdisciplinary area of study. But one of our purposes here, as well as just bringing together this group of people into one space, and to have that network of communication, is to raise the profile of sociology when it comes to music, because it is interesting times at the moment for music in the world, and there's a lot of public and media discourse and government discourse about music, and we think sociologists should be in that conversation. So that's one of our purposes here too. And so we had our first dedicated panel at the TASA conference last year. There were 5 papers there, and we're looking to do the same this year. We also staged our own group symposium last year in Brisbane called Music Lives or Music Lives. And that brought together sociologists of music with some other disciplines and also with industry and government stakeholders. And there's been interest coming from those sectors as well. For example, recently the Victorian Music Development Office were hosting for the first time ever, they wanted to hold an event that was all about highlighting research being done in relation to their industry. And they reached out to Kath and myself and to our group in constructing that symposium. So there's an interest out there in what we're doing, which is great to see. So I believe, today, to give a brief introduction, we are going to hear from Hannah Fairlamb, speaking about her research in DIY music scenes. And we're going to hear from Christy Bosworth speaking about stadiumism or stadiumisation, but as you can see behind Christy there, the impact of this phenomenon of stadium shows. So we're going to start with Hannah Fairlamb, who's based at University of Melbourne and in the late stages of her PhD at the moment. So I'll hand over to Hannah. We'll have Hannah's talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end, and feel free to write into the chat if you want to. Take it away, Hannah.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if my camera's working. My computer has just been randomly restarting itself for no reason lately. So I'm sorry if I drop out again. But I'll just share my slides and hopefully we'll get through this. Okay. So I've had to request sharing. Here we go. Okay. So thanks for the introduction, Ben, and thanks to everyone who's here today. I'm going to be talking through some ideas I've been having about the idea of utopia. So this is something I'm writing about in my thesis at the moment. So this is kind of a thought in progress where I'm talking about, so my thesis focuses on gender equality activism, particularly grassroots sort of activism in Australian music scenes, focusing on DIY. So I'm going to talk through some ideas I've been having about how utopia might fit in that sort of, conceptualization. So again, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm also on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge the ongoing unbroken connection of First Nations people to the lands, waters and skies of this area, and also acknowledge that Indigenous people in Australia were the first artists, musicians and activists on this land. So to give an idea of what I'm going to talk about, it's mostly what is DIY music, what is a utopia, how does the concept of utopia show up in DIY, and what does all of this mean for DIY music scenes in Australia? So DIY is, we still use the term DIY to refer to the practice of doing projects around the house. So instead of hiring a tradesperson, doing it yourself. And this has kind of been borrowed into music scenes, particularly associated with punk scenes of the 1970s, where you can make music by yourself with your own tools, things that you've already got lying around. You don't have to spend heaps of money, that you can do this without any assistance from record companies and without having a proper qualification or a certain level of skill. So in my PhD, I'm seeing DIY as a field, so a system of relations that Bourdieu calls relatively autonomous social microcosms or spaces of objective relations. And the field of DIY is commonly defined as anti-establishment, anti-capitalist and anti-consumerist, and against more mainstream, mass-produced and commodified forms of cultural production. And what about utopia? So utopia is this made-up name for a fictional island that a writer called Thomas More came up with in 1516, so quite a long time ago. And he combined these Greek words to come up with the word utopia. That means no place, like it doesn't exist. So it's a play on words. He's combined the word utopia, which means good place, and utopia, which is no place. So this idea that it's this imaginary great place, but it actually doesn't exist. So while More's text was arguably satire, it's also useful politically. And the author Duncombe says that while it stretches credulity to suggest that More expected his audience to fully believe that utopia is real, it's reasonable to argue that he uses fantasy to articulate political, economic and religious alternatives he really believes in. And utopia was meant to be experienced by the reader as a valid alternative to the real world in which they lived. So the concept of utopia is often used popularly to imagine perfect or ideal worlds. Scholars of DIY and utopia often talk about this in the context of sort of anarchic separatist communities, living in squats, trying to live by the principles of anarchy where power is equally distributed and decisions made by consensus. But apart from that sort of total lifestyle movement, DIY music scenes that I researched were more loosely connected communities of bands and musicians. They sometimes lived together, most of the time they didn't, but their connections were more made through live shows, being at live music shows together. I just want to note at this point that utopia is not something that I was seeking to investigate when I started my PhD, so I'm applying it retrospectively to my data. And participants in my research define DIY in different ways, and these point to the kinds of utopias that they imagined for the field of DIY. So what's the problem? DIY is an incomplete utopia, which you could argue all attempts at utopia are. But the critical point I want to make here is that DIY is framed by its participants as anti-establishment, but it reproduces and in some cases reinforces or magnifies mainstream structures like the gender order that produces patriarchal societies. So there's a failure between theory and practice there, with gender inequality being one example of a struggle that continues to show up as an issue. Just this week, there's been a band in music news called Royal Otis that have come out. They've been called out for, among other things, misogynist lyrics that they've actually come out in defense of. So this just shows that gender inequality is still a problem that continues to recur in DIY music scenes. So looking at the the feminist activism that's happened in music scenes, a lot of that came out of DIY, and it was using sort of grassroots DIY methods. So this suggests that the field of DIY has a lot further to go in terms of continuing to reach for utopia. For example, the organisation Listen came from criticism about a book published in 2014 about Australian underground music scenes. And the book was seen as kind of overly masculine, was written by a man. The bands featured were mostly men, and the descriptions of women in the book were described as problematic. So this criticism sparked an online Facebook group, which then led to the creation of an organisation in offline spaces as well, called Listen, and that organisation was a real leader in the activist space from 2015 to 2020, and that was their logo. There's also this new Instagram account that's popped up in the last couple of weeks called This Is Boring, with that blurb there that says it's boring when you don't get any women to play in your new band, or when you don't put a single non-male band on your lineup. And this kind of follows on from an account called Lineups Without Males that's been going for several years. And they do side-by-side comparisons of these festival bills with the all-male acts removed to show the stark sort of gender disparity. So these are all examples of grassroots activism that use DIY methods, and they operate outside of more institutional structures and show the ways people engage in activism, how they imagine a more utopian world where the sexism and misogyny that they're drawing attention to no longer exists. So in order to move closer to a DIY utopia, these music scenes have a lot of work to do in terms of addressing gendered issues like gender-based violence, misogyny, and sexism. So what do activists have to do with utopia? So I mentioned earlier that I never set out to study utopias or apply this theory to my research, but my focus has been really on gender equality activism from the grassroots in music scenes. So that's why I make reference to activism in this presentation, even though it's not the focus. The link is that I see activism as a way of reaching for utopia, because it's a form of resisting and therefore pointing out things that need to change, which is a way of prefiguring ideas about how things could be better, which is a utopian mindset. And I popped this quote in here from an activist I interviewed, who said, "I would hope that that's what is coming out of our work, that people should be caring for each other, kind to each other, working together as a community to create spaces that you want to be in and to create the kind of world that you want to live in, and that that's possible to do that, and it's possible to do it together." So this kind of imagination, forward thinking, prefiguring of what things could be like. So what do gendered utopias look like in DIY? The data that I have collected includes responses from people of all sorts of different genders. When disaggregating responses by gender, there are trends in the way people describe their visions of what DIY is and should be. So I've loosely grouped people in terms of gender in order to be able to talk about gender. And a quick note on my methods. So I collected qualitative data through an online anonymous survey and also some semi-structured interviews that I conducted in capital cities, but also in Newcastle, because it's known as a DIY hub. And that was between April 2023 and April 2024. And I have analysed it using inductive thematic analysis in NVivo. So there were 48 women in that data set, 20 non-binary people, 22 men, and 3 people who didn't specify gender. And the data I'm talking about today responds to my first research question, which is how do people, it's particularly Australian DIY music scenes, define DIY? Some of the top themes that people mentioned, I had 18 themes in total for this research question, but the top ones mentioned by gender. For women and binary people was this theme alone or together, which captured what people said about the relational aspects of DIY. Who do you DIY with? Do you do it yourself or do you do it with others? For men, there was a tie for the top themes mentioned. 91% of men mentioned both the themes society and money. The theme society included categories about the relationship between DIY and society, like the influence of society on DIY music making and vice versa, the framing of DIY as against society or a threat to society, and the opposition of DIY to societal structures, and in particular capitalism. Money included categories like it's not about making money and it's about doing a lot with a little. So these two themes, the top two themes for men, link together in a definition similar to that I gave earlier, where DIY is about being anti-capitalist, anti-consumerist, and anti-establishment. So maybe some broad conclusions we could draw here about gendered utopias in DIY, that for women and non-binary people, the relational aspects were more important in defining DIY, whereas for men, it was more important that DIY be anti-establishment and anti-capitalist. So looking at DIY as a field of relations, so that first theme, the top theme for women and non-binary people, these percentages are the proportion of people in that gender that had responses coded into that category. So we can see in the table that all of these themes here, the codes, it's about connection and community, doing it together, reciprocity and sharing, generosity and support, and caring for each other, were all a greater proportion of women and non-binary people were represented in those codes than men. And particularly the code is about caring for each other. That it was four times greater for women and 5 times greater for non-binary people than it was for men. So this all suggests that a DIY utopia for women and non-binary people is more likely to be about connecting with people, being in community, sharing resources, supporting each other, and caring for each other. And a couple of quotes related to that from Reed, who said, if the first domino is making sure that you do something your own way, then the first building block has to be community, because without that, you don't have anything. And Sam, who said, you can kind of create your own networks, which I think is like based in mutual aid, which is based in community care, it's based in sharing of knowledge. And then moving on to look at one of the top themes for men, society. A greater proportion of men than other genders said that DIY was against society and that it's about social change. There were similar proportions across gender for other definitions of DIY, things like it being a counterculture, pushing back against norms, and being against capitalism. So this suggests maybe these framings are common across people of different genders in DIY music scenes. What I did find interesting was that even though 36% of men acknowledged that DIY was part of broader society, only half that proportion were said things that were coded into this category that DIY reproduces broader societal problems. So what this might tell us about gendered utopias in DIY is that there's broad agreement across people of different genders in DIY scenes that it's part of a bigger societal structure. It's countercultural, it's anti-establishment. Maybe men are less likely to acknowledge the possibility that these scenes might actually be problematic and maybe part of the establishment itself. And some quotes around that, for example, from Cara, I think DIY is in so many ways a direct response to the formal structures of capitalism. Imogen, who said, I definitely think that DIY is against capitalistic spaces and general society and consumer spaces as well. And the idea that it's about the individual when you have to purchase and consume. And this was a response from a man called Barney, who is part of that 18% who did recognise that DIY might reproduce some of these broader societal issues. He said, I became more aware of the disparity of equality in the punk scene, that a lot of the same kind of social tropes play out in the punk scene where they don't think they do, but they definitely do. And he goes on to elaborate a little bit further on that as well. So another interesting thread in the data was around this notion of outsiderness, where greater proportions of men frame DIY as being outside the mainstream and attracting outsiders. So maybe this suggests that men who feel left out of broader neoliberal society feel drawn to cultural fields like DIY music, maybe because they feel more included there. People like Oliver, who said, growing up in this area, being a young person that doesn't belong anywhere, I just kind of happened to find things like punk and hardcore and weird music. And Faith as well, who said a lot of people who are in these scenes are people that feel rejected or not heard by these other scenes like the mainstream. And extending this a bit further, in the next two lines of this table, you can see that men were the highest proportion of people who said that DIY is for everyone, but then women were more likely to point out that not everyone's welcome in DIY compared with men. So this suggests maybe there's something going on here. Maybe it's about gatekeeping, and maybe this is gendered gatekeeping. And I'm also really interested in this, the idea in the context of the higher proportion of men that talked about DIY being about power. So this seems antithetical to a field that's often constructed as anti-establishment. So linking this back in with men's framing of DIY as a place where outsiders can belong and the ways women and non-binary people noted the presence of gatekeeping, I wonder if there's something here about how men feel at home in DIY scenes and feel they can claim some sort of gendered ownership or belonging that maybe they then regulate in terms of gatekeeping and boundary making, making it harder for people of other genders to join in. And there's data to support this. So 25% of women and 30% of non-binary people said there were barriers to participating in DIY, and that was greater than the 18% of men that said things along similar lines. So the most commonly mentioned barriers were emotional barriers, where people felt like they couldn't join in or they had negative feelings, physical access barriers to do with disability, and things like age and cost. So why does it matter? I think it matters because if DIY is a utopian space where people are imagining a better community or a better world, a better field, a utopia that accepts gender inequality as the status quo is incomplete and insufficient. Gender equality activists in DIY music scenes have sought to resist and refuse to be complicit in this reproduction. So their work's an invitation to continue to consider the ways a field framed as anti-establishment and anti-capitalist can further resist and refuse oppressions, including things like gender inequality, racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, classism, and so on. So to summarize, utopia is about imagination, but also about the real world. So it's about the abstract and the concrete. DIY music scenes are utopian in some ways, but this could be taken further. Gender equality is one way in which DIY music communities could strive to become more utopian. And gender equality activists work to make this a reality now. So rather than it being an abstract imaginary, pulling that into the concrete. And that's it from me. Is it question time, Ben?
Yes, there's absolutely question time. So feel free to, well, let's say put your hand up or write in the chat. Kath.
I'm really sorry my video's not working. I'm not sure what to do.
Yeah, Hannah was here before, but she's disappeared.
Oh, she's gone. Hannah, that was so great.
Thank you.
So interesting. That's making my brain pop. It looks like, can I just chuck a suggestion in there?
Yeah.
Like you mentioned that the men, like the differences between, yes, what the men and the women were saying, absolutely amazing. That the men are sort of like saying, they think it's for outsiders. They think that it's like they're less interested in that sort of connection stuff with people. And I wonder, like, to what extent, like, were the men that you spoke to musicians, or like, what was their role generally in these DIY spaces?
Yeah, so mostly musicians, but also people who organise shows, not necessarily musicians themselves. A couple of people who ran DIY spaces. So they were like venue managers, that kind of thing. But yeah, it was mostly musicians.
I mean, it made me wonder to what extent, for those men, DIY spaces and utopia, like more generally, is a place where they are special. Not just where they are accepted, but where they are special, where they stand out, where they are the person who everybody is looking at and praising. Because that idea of like coming into those DIY spaces, like, I think conceptualizing yourself as an outsider is a way of telling people that you're special. And then this sort of idea of I don't want to have other people, like, it's not about being connected to other people, it's about me and my thing. Which also, like, musicians, I think that there's sort of that literature on musicians and their sort of conceptualization of how they see their careers playing out, which is very much caught up in that idea of, like, success for them. So the idea of success in these DIY spaces for these men is to be the special person. And I mean, the word I wrote down when you were going through all that stuff is ego, but that's not a very sociologically helpful thing.
It's interesting that you say that, because I did have a little coding category about DIY being about think small. So minimizing the ego and like small spaces, small groups, and moving away from things like big shows. Like, it was really about smallness for some people, but it wasn't a dominant theme. It was really sort of a minimal theme in terms of representation in the data.
Yeah, okay. But yeah, no, very interesting that the men seemed much more interested in holding themselves separate and being a special category rather than being incorporated into the thing. And yeah, so you've got a situation there where utopia might look really, really different to the two groups of people, or the three groups of people, or the multiple, or whatever many groups of people you're looking at there. Did you have any thoughts about how to, and if it is possible to reconcile those things? Like, do you think that the sort of activism that women are undertaking has the potential to, like, bridge that divide? Or do you think that, like, the work you're doing in understanding what that divide actually looks like might be like a step in working out how that could happen?
I think that the activism is always an appeal. It's not just trying to change things. It's an appeal to, like, it's saying this isn't good enough and we can do better. It's not saying I'm going to do better. It's saying that we can do better, and it won't work unless we're all invested in making this better. And that's why things are still happening. New grassroots campaigns are still popping up here and there, because things haven't changed. We're in this kind of post-feminist space where you get, like, the quote that I provided from Barney, who was talking about punk scenes being, oh, we're above all that. This is an equal space. And that really just shuts down conversations about how it might not be an equal space. So I think there needs to be an openness for men to receiving this kind of criticism, really, and to being able to say thank you for bringing this to my attention, and we can actually do something about this. I think that, yeah, the issue is that sort of preconception that the DIY space is separate to society, and it is different just by being framed as, like, if you say you're anti-establishment, then you are. It doesn't actually, if it doesn't happen in practice, then there's a disconnect between the framing and the reality.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking about how you could use that understanding that maybe there's a bunch of men that are just looking to feel special, and how that can be used as, like, by people who are trying to work towards this gender equality as a way of getting those people to maybe take actions that they might not have otherwise, without going down the path of, like, you know, putting them on a pedestal for having done any tiny thing. Like, that seems like it's an avenue that might be worth, like, not you. Sorry, I'm just yabbering because I'm so excited by everything I just heard. Sorry.
Thank you, Katha. It's very interesting. But yes, like you said, it would be a very fine line between figuring out how to get people on board without also giving out feminist cookies.
We can have another question if there's any. Looks like Kat.
Yeah, I've got one. Sorry, I can't seem to find the hand raised thing.
I saw your
Anyway,
real life.
yeah, physically. Thanks for an interesting presentation, Hannah. I was wondering, I'm also fascinated by the the allure of outsider status as something to make people feel special. And that kind of reminds me, I might be drawing a long bow here, but it reminds me a bit of how incel communities work, or how those really misogynistic spaces end up becoming, you know, well, I don't know how to put it, how those spaces where men gather to feel special together because they somehow feel pushed out or confronted by any form of feminism. Did you find in any of the data that how toxic did it start to get? Was there any kind of inference even that some of these spaces end up down that road, if it is essentially kind of what Kath is saying, this outside of this feeling of specialness?
Thanks for the question, Kat. I think because it didn't come up in interviews as much. I think because when you're in a face-to-face situation with someone who's a feminist researcher, you're less likely to say things along those lines. But probably a couple of the survey responses would be more along those lines, where it was anonymous, so people could just say what they like. So there were a couple of men who said things like, "I feel like I've lost opportunities because I'm a man, and I'm not allowed in these spaces that are just exclusive spaces for women and non-binary people." And so I actually feel left out. So there is that kind of sense in some, in a couple of the responses, but it wasn't a really strong theme. So I think what you're saying about the connection with incel spaces is really interesting. But what I would say is that while it's not explicit in that way, I did have a code called passive gatekeeping, where I was gathering sort of instances where men were saying things that they probably didn't know at the time were actually quite exclusionary. So ways of talking and behaving that really don't acknowledge this problem and don't address it, and aren't interested in addressing it.
Yeah, thanks. That's it's just really interesting findings from your data.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic discussion. Thank you. Well, we might move on now. Thank you, Hannah. We might move on now to Christy's presentation, and of course have more discussion after that. So Christy Bosworth is undertaking her PhD at the University of Wollongong.
Hi, everyone. I'll just share my slides. And yeah, that was an awesome presentation, Hannah. There's a lot of overlap between ours that I'd love to chat to you more about later for sure. Okay, yeah, so as Ben said, I'm doing my PhD at the University of Wollongong. I'm just coming into my fourth year, my final year with this at the moment. So I am just up to the stage of coding, deep encoding, analyzing of my data. So everything I'm going to be talking about today is very much just emerging themes relating to today's topic. Because it's such a work in progress, I'd also really love as much feedback as possible at the end. Let me pull up my notes here. Okay, so themes I'm currently developing from the research data surround how global processes of digitalization, consolidation, and what I call stadiumism work to sustain sociocultural inequalities, disproportionately affecting emerging grassroots artists while continuing to maintain and strengthen the platforms of established artists, especially mega pop stars. My participants have described the greater cultural and political consequences of this, the ways in which this contributes to escalating precarity for grassroots artists, as well as the potential of this for long-term cultural homogenisation. My project focuses specifically on the impacts of these global shifts on local underground grassroots musicians within the indie scene of Wollongong, New South Wales. So just a quick overview of my project and research questions to start. I've now finished 21 in-depth interviews with people across the live music ecosystem of the Illawarra region, spanning from the steel city of Wollongong, including its post-industrial neighbour Port Kembla, up the coastline into the more gentrified northern suburbs such as Thirroul, where I'm embedded in the local indie music scene. The alternative music cultural history of Wollongong is long established, and this scene continues to grow, now being a regular stop on the circuit for touring artists, as well as attracting a huge migration of especially underground indie musicians to the area. This makes it a really interesting and unique site for ethnographic analysis. I interviewed mainly indie musicians, as well as small venue owners, labels, bookers, and organisers, though due to the size of the town and the nature of indie music, many people wore all of these hats all at once. I should also say here that defining indie is quite complex, as this no longer strictly stands for independent. As these musicians, they might be on small indie labels or have a team to support them. But I use the term to describe musicians with an indie ethos rooted in authenticity and autonomy, and a style of music that is more experimental and alternative, and as David Hessenhaug has also said, is rooted in punk's institutional and aesthetic resistance to the mainstream popular music industry. So through interviews, my questions explored how participants describe the contemporary global problems such as digitalisation and stadiumism affecting live music culture, and how these are impacting grassroots music practices, which is going to be the focus of today. Why this needs to change, how they describe sociocultural and political value of their indie grassroots live music practice, and how they describe what needs to change and who this is up to, what would help them to survive this current live music crisis. So global processes such as market consolidation, digitalisation, and platformisation have contributed to what I call here stadiumism, to describe the trend towards massive stadium concerts over smaller grassroots shows in terms of both live music consumption and production. The bolstering and strengthening of mega pop artists throughout COVID was exponential due to their privileged platforms across big labels and digital worlds, whereas grassroots music was not supported in the same way, which I'll give examples of later through some interview data. Participants, especially small venue owners, spoke about their experiences with consolidation processes, such as the way Live Nation monopolises the market, supporting and promoting established artists at the expense of local grassroots musicians who cannot compete with this and struggle to make money from shows. Participants also described notable shifts in consumer patterns, where punters are saving up huge money for 1 or 2 stadium concerts a year at the expense of spreading this out and going to more regular, smaller shows. They say a large part of this is due to risk, which comes more so under a cost of living crisis, where even small nights out have become big choices to make under tight budgets. Basically, people are scared of wasting their money on an unknown, potentially mediocre indie show, in contrast to the safer, somewhat predictable experience they know they'll have at Taylor Swift. This has huge ramifications for the already undervalued grassroots music scene, for small venues, as well as emerging musicians that really need these venues to develop in and connect to the local indie community. So I'm going to show you a range of quotes from the interview data now. Sorry. That help to articulate these themes. I'll just say a little bit about them and then leave them for you to read yourselves. So this musician describes the impact of this consumption shift towards stadiumism in how much this affects small venues and emerging artists. This musician describes this problematic of oligarchical pop concerts, saying this homogenisation is a big issue because of diversity. So while that was talking more about this kind of overall trend towards stadiumism and consumer patterns, this pull towards stadiumism also affects artistic production, as participants describe processes they regularly experience under neoliberal capitalist music culture, in which their artistic production is under extrinsic pressures towards commercialization and commodification processes, and ultimately towards transforming their art into something to be played at a stadium for mass commercial appeal. Participants described this extrinsic pressure compromising their authentic artistry and autonomy, fundamental values under what I'm calling the indie ethos, to describe the value sets of these underground indie artists. These compromises include things like making their music more palatable for particular audiences in particular spaces, and making their music generally more basic and less experimental in order to appeal to the masses. It's interesting also that some of my participants have actually gone through this and played stadium shows on a big international scale, but as this didn't align with them, decided to downscale and move to this town where they could participate in a more underground community. The commercialization of authentic artistry has huge ramifications for culture more broadly, contributing towards cultural homogenisation, as art with potential to resist the mainstream status quo becomes commodified, which I'll speak more to later. This artist describes commercial pressures he experienced towards playing stadium rock in his former band, describing how it got taken up this echelon into what was essentially corporate greed. This musician similarly describes how performance pressures compromise her authentic artistry in having to mold her music to fit specific spaces. Another artist similarly described commercial compromises made for mass appeal, saying as people play those larger and larger venues, he feels like emotionally or creatively it goes the other way. He says you just have to make everything a bit of a parody of itself. So participants have described the processes contributing towards stadiumism that disadvantage emerging artists, enabling bigger artists to get bigger at the expense of diverse local grassroots music. They spoke about digital platforms such as social media and Spotify that work to sustain established artists through COVID, as these artists had the privilege of extensive online fan bases in a time when everything shifted online, compared to grassroots activities that are about connection and community in person and don't exist to the same degree online. Others spoke of their experiences accessing rich white male dominated music scenes as emerging artists and ways in which the lack of diverse representation also works to sustain social inequalities in music scenes. They also discussed the problematic nature of the dominant grant system in Australia and how this privileges established artists. None of these are new inequities that emerged through the pandemic, but like with so many things, the pandemic exacerbated underlying problems of inequalities, platforms, and privilege. So this local Filipino musician described the barriers of the underrepresentation of people of colour she experienced as an emerging artist in her local music scene, saying she never entertained the idea of doing the thing because she didn't see herself in any of them, being rich white men. A local booker and organiser described the implications of the dominance of digital culture through the pandemic, saying that's why Taylor Swift is the biggest thing in the world and all the smaller stuff is smaller than it's ever been. I know there's a bit of a focus on Taylor Swift. It wasn't meant to be like that, but she was spoken about a lot. A local festival organiser similarly explains the challenges local grassroots festivals faced, whose nature is offline, saying it's about the experience of the human when you're there. This musician described the political implications of the consolidated digital distribution of music and how he believes this direction for music, being controlled by central bodies, works to sustain the political system and status quo. This musician, who also works for the government in the grant space, describes ways in which the grant system works to reproduce cultural inequalities by enabling the good musicians to get even better. So my participants spoke extensively about how these global trends have heightened what was already a highly precarious artistic pathway for them. This continues to affect some artists more than others, disproportionately affecting diverse, marginalised artists. The overwhelmingly dominant theme emerging from the data is around participants' escalating experiences of financial precarity and ways in which this affects their ability to make music. Musicians talk about needing money to not only survive day to day through this cost of living crisis, but to actually continue pursuing musical pathways. Many discuss their experiences of burnout with the music hustle and having to make choices to negotiate their time through side jobs, adopt a hobbyist mentality, or leave the industry entirely. So this interview was done in peak COVID in 2021, and it highlighted the detrimental impact of the pandemic on this artist's music making through his experiences of burnout and his decision to leave the industry due to facing too many hurdles. He says that there's only so much optimism people can have. This artist describes her shift towards a hobbyist mindset that she's had to adopt in reframing music as something just fun that she does on the weekend. This musician describes negotiating his time between music and side jobs and the effect that this has on his artistry, saying that he feels stunted by this and held back by the system. And this musician summarizes pretty well the issue of artistic precarity. So while the issue of precarity is not necessarily a surprising finding, the detail to which they explain their personal experiences of this escalating situation was profound, especially through the conversations around the greater long-term cultural consequences of this. If these indie diverse musicians are not able to contribute their voices and stories to broader music culture. Participants described the political and cultural consequences of alternative experimental music becoming harder to make, as these musicians struggle to keep making this kind of countercultural music that holds potential to resist the status quo. These conversations were both interesting and alarming in discussing how participants imagine the ramifications of this, with dystopian visions of a future monoculture developing through processes of cultural homogenisation. So this artist imagines a dystopian future of homogenized music if emerging diverse artists continue to struggle, being a world full of hyperpop, capitalist, marketable music. This artist explains how not amplifying marginalized voices that need to be heard to contribute to a diverse, healthy society will ultimately contribute to the hegemony. And in summarizing the cultural consequences of music not being supported, this artist said, I wonder if there's been like a few Bob Dylans or Joni Mitchells or whoever in this country that have just thought it's too hard, fuck it. So to finish, these emerging themes I've spoken about are around the impacts of stadiumism on grassroots music culture and both the cultural and political consequences of the homogenization of culture that these participants are facing under a heightened neoliberal industry. Other themes emerging from the data are around ways in which these musicians and the whole ecosystem in this scene also have a sense of resisting this through do-it-yourself and do-it-together culture that is fundamental to their indie ethos. This sense of taking things into their own hands to make the culture happen and try to survive this current live music crisis. These emerging themes are also really interesting in terms of beliefs around who is responsible for fixing this crisis, with participants expressing that ideally systemic change be made fundamentally, especially through funding, which would then empower the musicians to be able to create the culture themselves. As much as they say this is the ideal scenario, they also ultimately believe that the government and Australian ideology more broadly is not ready to really value music to the extent of funding it on a permanent basis. And it's this belief that is the foundation of this DIY, do it together culture. This sense of community and agency they have based on the belief in the importance of indie underground grassroots music. And that's the end from me. I'll stop sharing. Like I said, yeah, this is all very much emerging. Thank you. This is all very much emerging and very much a work in progress. So I would really appreciate any suggestions for directions, either thematically or theoretically. If anyone's got any feedback for me, that would be great.
Can I just ask a question? You talked about, the sort of grants, privileges, and that the grassroots spaces are shrinking, basically. Where is the innovation actually happening then? Is it happening?
I'd say it still definitely is. There's still the people that I'm talking to, they're still doing it. It's just that it's really hard to do.
Mm.
There are still huge examples of these kind of underground communities that are making stuff happen. The problem is just how hard it is to make it happen.
Do you think funding models can be changed to actually support that? Like, is that an option? Is that realistic in any way?
What type of funding do you mean?
Oh, just you were talking about sort of grants and whatnot going to, you know, more musicians who are more well known.
Yeah.
Is there any way of fighting for there to be more in terms of supporting risk and experimentation?
Like for those kind of emerging grassroots artists.
Hmm.
I know like Wollongong Council does offer that for kind of
Mm.
emerging artists. It's just the problematic of the grant system. It is just so hard. It's so hard to put together a grant application, and even more so for those emerging artists. Like the opportunities are there for them to do it, but you know, it's just I actually have been working for a Sound New South Wales body in terms of going through these grant applications and approving them. And you really notice the people who can write grant applications are these experienced, established artists. It's so hard for emerging people to put together a grant application. So there are opportunities there for funding at that kind of base level, but it's just you really need like a team of people around you. You need like a manager or like a grants writer to engage, you know, and all of that costs money and yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, other. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I've just got, maybe this is more of a comment, but some of the things you were mentioning there, I couldn't help but see the parallels between, you know, the stadium, what we call it, stadiumization, or
Stadiumism. Yeah.
stadiumism. I find that hard to say.
Yeah.
Between that sort of pushing the grassroots or the smaller live music venues and that culture sort of to the side.
Yeah.
I couldn't help but see the parallels between that and some of the things people have been saying recently about listening habits, where you've got complaints about, you know, Triple J's Hottest 100 or whatever it is. People saying, oh, you know, there's so many big global stars now, or there's been quite famous people taking up space on community radio when it should be there for community. And I'm wondering whether even that might be worth. Actually, I don't know. Would that be worth mentioning? Is there any kind of connection or crossover, do you reckon?
Totally. It's all extremely interlinked, and people, yeah, like people have been definitely talking about that, and just these streaming platforms being such a like a part of that problem, you know. It's just this real push towards international artists and the algorithm just feeding that to you constantly, and it's it all contributes to that. And then seeing kind of, yeah, just the lack of Australian representation yeah, through Triple J and through these kind of big gatekeepers. It's a massive issue. It's all part of it. And I think, yeah, all of that is kind of part of this big umbrella term of stadiumism I'm talking about, for sure. Yeah.
So this is your term, stadiumism, Christy?
It is. And that's also a work in progress. If it's too hard to say, I might change it.
I think it's great. And I think it captures something that I think part of the frustration here is about this particular model of what success or what a successful music system looks like. And it seems like there's a frustration with the grant system and with maybe public discourse more broadly, or maybe this is my thing, but there's this well-meaning sort of discourse like, oh, small venues matter because that's where the next Oasis comes from, or that's where the next Coldplay comes from. And I kind of think, yeah, but also those spaces matter in themselves, and that's where I prefer to be.
Totally.
And you compare that to, say, classical music, where it might be much more normal to fund something that's not going to reach a stadium. It's like that thing that is for a very small audience is valuable in its own right. Is that a sort of a frustration or a tension here?
Totally. I think there's been a real tension coming up in my data around different kind of narratives people are talking about in terms of grassroots and emerging artists, because people talk about, when they talk about grassroots, it's kind of, yeah, like the importance is in and of itself. And so it's like the point of doing music in these small venues, like that's almost like the end goal. We're then talking to people who kind of have more of that like emerging ethos. That's more about that kind of I guess like instrumentalism of these venues. It's like using, there's a theme came up that was about like stepping stone development. And so that's about kind of viewing these places as like this instrumental place, because eventually you want to get to that stadium. You want to become Taylor Swift, which kind of goes really against that kind of grassroots indie ethos. But it's still, it's not like everyone that I spoke to had that real grassroots approach. Like there is still that emerging thing there of like trying to get somewhere else. It's definitely a tension. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I love having a word for that, that particular vision. It kind of reminds me of, different thing, but the way people critique the notion of developing nations as if there's only one path to follow.
Totally. Yeah. Like again, it's a stepping stone to get somewhere else. Yeah. It's interesting. Oh, thanks, Ben.
We do have time for more questions, if any.
Yeah, I'll ask a quick one. The themes that your respondents were bringing up are themes that have come up like so much in the history of popular music, sort of the opposition to commercialism or the sense that artists are precarious. Did your respondents have like a sense of the historicity of like the discourses that they were contributing to with that stuff? Like, do you think that they knew that some of these things are like just sort of perennial complaints that artists had, as opposed to, or do you think that they felt that they were the first people to be experiencing these things and putting it into the sort of context of some of the stuff that they were talking like? That's the
Like, did they have an idea, you mean, of kind of the history of artist precarity and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I guess so. Like, did they see their position as being like completely novel, and artists were never treated like this in the past, and this is a new thing that's sort of come just with these things like digitalization? Or do you think that they did have an appreciation that this has always been like, some of these things have always been present in the experience of musicians in places like Australia, well, everywhere probably?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one of the themes I had down was like things used to be better back in the day or something, like people kind of having this idea of things being better, and like now it's all gone to shit. But I think no, they definitely do still have this idea that precarity, like the struggling artist or the suffering artist, that's not like a new and novel idea. I think everyone's just really, it's this like reaching a threshold or something at the moment. Like the way people are talking about things is really, because it's all kind of snowballed under everything else that's happening in the world, and it's not like this is just a kind of what's the word, like it's not separate from everything else that is happening. So everyone's kind of feeling the pressure of just so many things all at once. And maybe that's a new thing. Maybe they're saying that like it's always been bad, or maybe like people kind of talk about things they used to be better in like the 80s or the 70s, and they look to like previous Australian governments and stuff like that, where there was a more flourishing kind of music culture. But yeah, there's definitely like a common sense that things have never been this bad, I guess, if that answers that. Yeah. Andy?
The only thing I'd say about this is that the stadiumisation thing. I mean, I remember seeing Simple Minds in the small club in '78, and it was like, hey, this is great. This is the new thing. 7 years later, they're playing stadiums, and their music has changed to suit that arena. Same thing for U2. Same thing for The Clash. All of these people started off with those kinds of sensibilities, but they just grew out of it, because they could command the audience. I think what is a difference here is that a lot of the artists who are now getting branded with this stadiumization thing are also put into that category of bland, effete pop, Taylor Swift, Coldplay. But it's, I think that would be one distinct difference. And also international artists coming to Australia. But internationally, I think this stadium thing has been a thing for a long time, and the push against stadiums as anathema to authentic, kind of felt rootsy underground music, whatever you call it. So I think that feeds into that historicity argument as well, as a thing. So that's all I would say.
Yeah, totally. That really makes me think of I don't know, just the whole uproar when Bob Dylan went electric, and this kind of thing through history of people critiquing that shift to stadiumism. Yeah. Well, that shift to becoming something bigger that's not that authentic, rootsy thing at the start. Yeah, I'll definitely have to look at the kind of history of that as well.
But I think that there's definitely been a shift. You're right. I think this whole packaging of the stadium experience is much more of an in-your-face thing now than it used to be. But,
yeah, interesting.
And that perhaps relates to, we do need to wrap up, but there is a comment from Diane Roger asking, I wondered if you're planning to look at why Taylor Swift was so frequently mentioned as a symbol of stadiumism, as you observed.
Yeah.
Seems like it's telling in terms of how authenticity is constructed and gendered tropes about pop music. If you have anything to say on that point.
How authenticity is constructed. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Taylor Swift was definitely, she's kind of the face of all of this. But people, they'd say, like Taylor Swift, but also, Ed Sheeran and Beyonce and blah, blah, blah. I don't know why Taylor Swift comes to the forefront so much. I think it is really, people did talk about that she kind of represents the status quo. She really represents this kind of, I don't know, rich, skinny, white girl thing, and the lyrics that she sings are generally, about breaking up with her boyfriend, and not that that's not an important theme also, but yeah, I haven't really gone down that yet of looking at kind of why she was so much the focus. Yeah, that's something I'll definitely have to think more about. Thanks for that, Diane. Some commentary on
Thanks very much. And so can we all please thank Christy and Hannah for their fantastic presentations of work in progress. Is there anything you would direct us towards that you have published, or should we all look forward to it?
Yeah, yet to be published, so look forward to something soon.
Thanks. And I know Hannah's having some technical difficulties, so I'm not sure if she's able to speak to us right now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I have one publication from my honours research from a few years back about the perception and experience of gender in the Australian music industry. And I have a book chapter draft coming out that Kath and Tammy have been looking at as well. So that book should be out next year. But all my other forthcoming stuff is in draft at the moment.
Cool. Well, all the best with writing up this fantastic research.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for coming. We'll see everyone, look forward to seeing everyone at the TASA conference, if not before.